Sacred Heart Hospital, Norfolk, Virginia. 2 in the morning. The trauma bay smells like antiseptic and the ghost of every crisis that's walked through these doors in the past 3 years. Hannah Clarke moves through the fluorescent glare with the kind of invisibility that comes from practice, practiced at being overlooked, practiced at being forgotten, practiced at being nobody. Her scrubs are 2 sizes too large. They hang on her like borrowed skin. The hair is pulled back in a bun so tight it pulls the skin at her temples, a habit from somewhere she doesn't think about anymore. Her name tag reads H. Clarke, RN, night shift. Nobody asks the H. Nobody cares. That's exactly how it needs to stay. She checks the 4 on post-op bay 3, a 42-year-old appendectomy, her fingers moving with mechanical efficiency. Monitor beeping its steady rhythm. Saline dripping at the correct rate. She doesn't need to think about this anymore. Her hands know what to do. Her hands have always known what to do, and that's the problem. The overhead intercom crackles. Routine admission coming up from emergency. Hannah nods to herself, makes a note, moves to the supply station. She pulls a sterile field, sets up instruments for the incoming case. Everything in its place. Everything controlled. Everything where she can see it. Her locker in the break room contains 3 things: a cracked NASA mug from a mission nobody remembers anymore, a photograph she hasn't looked at in 47 weeks, and a single dog tag on a broken chain. The metal is warm when she touches it in the dark. She doesn't know why she keeps reaching for it. The Pentagon had been very clear about the order. Forget the operation. Forget the location. Forget the names. Forget. But the dog tag is warm like skin, and it doesn't forget. Hannah had spent 3 years at Sacred Heart. 3 years of night shifts that meant she barely crossed paths with the day surgeons. 3 years of keeping her head down and her hand steady and her mouth absolutely shut. 3 years since Marjah had gone so catastrophically wrong that the military had erased her records like she was classified waste. They'd given her a new social security number. A civilian identity. Orders to disappear. Major Hannah Clarke didn't exist anymore. There was only H. Clarke, the mousy night shift nurse who never raised her voice, who always stayed late to finish charting, who brought no attention and asked for nothing. She'd been a trauma surgeon before. The best trauma surgeon they had. She'd lost count of how many lives fit into a rucksack, how many people she'd held together when their bodies were coming apart. She'd earned rank and respect and the kind of trust that only comes from watching someone pull you out of a kill zone while bullets are still coming through windows. But that Hannah Clarke had been buried in the same classified folder that held the hostage rescue operation that had ended with 3 of her 8-person team dead and the other 5 swearing never to speak of it again. So now she was nobody. Mousy. Forgettable. Safe. Dr. Caldwell arrives at 2:17 for his supervision round. His white coat is pristine. His tie is pressed. His reputation as Sacred Heart's trauma director enters the trauma bay approximately 30 seconds before his body does, a presence that makes the air pressure change, like a storm moving in from the Atlantic. He's 49 with the kind of jawline that cuts glass and the kind of authority that comes from believing you're the smartest person in every room. He probably is. That's not what makes him dangerous. Hannah watches him move through the bay from her position at the supply station. He checks the post-op appendectomy. He reviews the monitor strips. He makes notes on the chart with the kind of signature that takes up 3 lines. He glances at her once, a flicker of eyes across her face, dismissing her the way a man dismisses a cleaning supply, something functional but not worth remembering. Night shift running smoothly, he asks the charge nurse, not Hannah. Very smooth, doctor. No issues. Caldwell nods. He's already moving on. Hannah has returned to being invisible, which is exactly the point of her entire existence now. The admission from emergency arrives at 2:34. Motorcycle accident, 31-year-old male, broken clavicle and a laceration on his left shoulder that needs attention. Not serious. Not trauma level. Just another night in the life of a city hospital. The surgical resident, Dr. Martinez, comes up to assess. Hannah has worked with Martinez for times before. He's competent. He's also very aware that he's competing for one of 3 trauma fellowship spots, which means he's careful about protocol and visibility. Hannah assists. She sets up the field. She hands him instruments. She anticipates what he needs before he asks for it. When she reaches for the suture tray, 14-gauge silk, preloaded on the proper needle, her hands betray something. The tremor. It's microscopic. It's the kind of thing nobody notices if they're not looking for it. It's not fear. It's not nervousness. It's muscle memory. It's the ghost of holding a surgical tray steady while a generator was running outside and mortar fire was converting a compound into rubble 400 meters to the northwest. It's the echo of hands that had learned to stay perfectly still under pressure because 1 millimeter of deviation meant the difference between keeping someone alive and watching them bleed out. Dr. Martinez doesn't see it. He's focused on the laceration. Hannah's hands steady immediately. They always do. 3 years of practice means the tremor lasts less than a heartbeat. But Hannah feels it. She feels the muscle memory like a foreign object, like something dangerous moving beneath her skin, like a secret trying to break through the surface of her carefully constructed nobodiness. She clamps down on it. She focuses on breathing, the kind of breathing they teach you in interrogation resistance training, slow and measured and coming from somewhere deep in your diaphragm, the kind of breathing that keeps your heart rate at exactly 70 beats per minute even when your mind is somewhere else. The procedure takes 47 minutes. The laceration is cleaned. The clavicle fracture is stabilized. The patient will be fine. He'll wake up and never know that the nurse who assisted was the kind of surgical precision that comes from having trained for 18 months in a forward operating base in a valley the Pentagon still denies exists. Hannah helps transfer him to recovery. She charts his vitals. Systolic 128. Diastolic 72. Heart rate 68. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. Normal. Unremarkable. Safe. Dr. Caldwell passes her again at 3:15. He's reviewing the charts from the night shift. He glances at the motorcycle laceration repair, seems satisfied, moves on. He never looks at her directly. He doesn't need to. He's already decided exactly who Hannah Clarke is, a capable but unremarkable night shift nurse who follows orders and causes no problems. He has no idea that her hands learn precision in a place that officially doesn't exist. He doesn't see the faint burn scars on her forearms, marks she tells curious residents came from a kitchen accident when she was 12 years old. He doesn't notice the way her eyes track exits and entrances, the way her posture changes slightly whenever the trauma alert system activates, the way she moves through Sacred Heart like she's mapping fields of fire. He doesn't know that the woman he just dismissed has a Distinguished Service Cross sitting in a classified folder somewhere in the Pentagon basement, along with the names of 8 operators who've been ordered never to speak of each other again. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Hannah had been following orders for 3 years. The worst part was that she had become, genuinely, the mousy night shift nurse with the careful hands and the quiet voice. The worst part was that she was almost safe. The next voice they heard came through the emergency department radio at 3:41. Incoming urgent. 38-year-old male, gunshot wound to the abdomen, massive hemorrhagic shock, unresponsive. ETA for minutes. We're not going to make it in time. He's coded twice already. The trauma bay erupts into organized chaos. 5 minutes later, they would call in 5 doctors to assess this patient. 5 doctors would examine him in succession. And Hannah would stand at the edge of the trauma bay with a dog tag burning warm against her chest underneath her scrubs, watching every single one of them decide that this man was unsalvageable. But that was still for minutes away. For now, the fluorescent lights buzzed their electric hum, and Hannah Clarke was just a nurse preparing for a case she'd been trained never to exist anymore. The overhead page crackled at 0400 hours, and the entire night shift heard it. Can someone tell Clarke the cowboy that this is a hospital, not a rodeo? Trauma supplies aren't toys. The voice was Dr. Caldwell's, deliberate, amused, and pitched just loud enough to carry across the entire trauma floor. Hannah stood at the nurse's station, her hand steady on the counter. Around her, heads lifted from charts. Eyes turned. A resident bit back a smile. One of the older nurses looked away, embarrassed for her. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric hum, and Hannah took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened. Nothing more. She did not blush. She did not tremble. She did not retreat to the supply closet to cry. She simply turned back to the stack of discharge orders in front of her and kept working. The page had been heard by 12 people. By 0800 hours, it would be the story told in every break room, every corridor, every corner of the hospital. Just a nurse who'd overstepped. Just a cowboy playing doctor. The name would stick like blood on scrubs. 2 days later, Hannah was restocking the supply closet on 3 East when the door clicked shut behind her. Caldwell was there, blocking the exit, his arms crossed like a man settling in for an interrogation. The small space suddenly felt smaller. His presence made the air pressure change, the way it does when a predator enters a room where prey is already cornered. "That stunt you pulled yesterday," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Questioning my discharge order in front of the resident. "You're a nurse, Clarke. You take orders, you don't give them. You don't interpret scans. You don't contradict attending physicians in front of trainees. Do it again, and I'll have your license reviewed by the board for insubordination and practicing beyond scope. Your credentials will be flagged. You understand what that means?" She did understand. It meant career death. It meant every hospital in Virginia would see a complaint before they saw her resume. It meant the permanent note, unreliable, insubordinate, dangerous. Hannah met his eyes. Crystal clear, "Doctor." She spoke the words the way she might have ordered a junior medic to move an amputee, her voice flat and calm as a glacier. A single tear escaped her left eye without warning, her body betraying her discipline, physics asserting itself over will. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without flinching, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Caldwell smirked and stepped aside, the door swinging open. "See that it stays clear." He left. Hannah stood alone in the closet for another 30 seconds, restocking bandages with movements so precise they could have been measured by instruments. The reassignments came next. Caldwell had spent 22 years at Sacred Heart Hospital, and those years had purchased him a network of allies, nurses who owed him favors, residents who feared his evaluation scores, techs who depended on his recommendations for advancement. He used them methodically. First, Marcus, the trauma tech who'd worked Hannah's shift for 18 months and had started asking questions about why she read EKGs with the precision of someone who'd done it under fire. Reassigned to medical surgical floors. Then Jennifer, the charge nurse who'd quietly supported Hannah during the overhead page incident. Moved to the pediatric unit effective immediately. Then David, the respiratory therapist who'd mentioned Hannah's knowledge seemed unusual for a standard track RN. Night shift respiratory coverage was suddenly needed at the sister hospital in Virginia Beach. 45 minutes away. Hannah watched it happen with the clinical detachment of someone recognizing a surgical approach. Caldwell was fragmenting her support network with the precision of someone cutting away damaged tissue. By Thursday, everyone she'd relied on during the night shift was gone. The people who might have defended her were scattered across the hospital system like shrapnel. She was alone on the unit now, the only person she could trust being herself. The parking lot was dark and wet when she clocked out Friday morning. Rain hammered the asphalt like applause no one wanted. It was 0620 hours, just as the day shift was arriving, 12 nurses, 3 residents, 2 attending physicians clustering near the entrance, their shoulders hunched against the weather. Caldwell was waiting for her by her car, rain running down his face. He didn't seem to notice. Or care. His voice carried across the parking lot with the precision of someone who'd timed this moment down to the second. "Hannah, effective immediately you're reassigned to Unit A duties. Your clinical judgment needs recalibration. Report to 3 West tomorrow for orientation. The morning shift stopped walking. Heads turned. They watched her the way people watch a public execution, uncomfortable, fascinated, relieved it wasn't them. Unit aid. Bedpans and linen changes. The bottom of the nursing hierarchy. 3 years of rebuilding a career, of proving competence through invisible excellence, of earning respect through meticulous work, erased in a single sentence delivered in front of witnesses. Hannah stood in the rain, water running down her face, and said nothing. Her hands did not clench into fists. Her voice did not crack. She looked directly at Caldwell with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Then she turned and got in her car. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel, not moving, not crying, not anything. Just breathing. Just existing in the space between destruction and what came next. In the review mirror, she watched the morning shift disappear into the hospital. The whispers started before she'd even turned the key in the ignition. She sat there for 20 minutes. The engine running. The heater on. Her hand steady on the wheel. Rain drummed the roof like Morse code, spelling out something she didn't have the energy to decode. When she finally drove out of the lot, she didn't go home. She drove to the waterfront instead, parked near the naval shipyard, and watched the destroyers sitting idle in their berths like sleeping giants. She thought about Marjah. She thought about 8 faces in a unit photo, 3 now dead, all of them ghosts she'd been ordered never to speak of again. She thought about a colonel with a broken dog tag and shallow breathing, lying in a trauma bay while 5 doctors refused to touch him. She thought about muscle memory that lived in hands and wouldn't stay buried no matter how long she pretended it didn't exist. The water was grey. The sky was greyer. No one knew who she was. No one here knew what she'd done or what it had cost her or what it meant that she was supposed to be invisible forever. But that invisibility had a shelf life. You could only suppress a major for 3 years before something gave way. At 0212 hours on Saturday morning, the doors to Sacred Heart's trauma unit crashed open. The ambulance crew wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man in his 50s, his tactical gear soaked with blood, his breathing coming in shallow gasps. The heart monitor screamed its alarm. For lines were already running, 2 large-bore 18-gauge needles, blood products flowing, but the colonel's pressure was dropping faster than the fluids could replace it. Catastrophic internal bleeding. His abdomen was rigid. His pelvis was fractured. No accessible surgical approach was going to stop this hemorrhage in time. Hannah helped guide the stretcher into Trauma Bay 1, her hands moving through the choreography of crisis with the fluid precision of someone who'd done it in sandstorm conditions and worse. Dr. Caldwell arrived within 3 minutes, his eyes scanning the monitor, the labs, the imaging they'd already started pulling. He's lost too much blood, Caldwell said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and finality. Damage patterns incompatible with survival. No viable options. We're not prolonging suffering here. He wrote the order and left. Dr. Martinez came next, reviewed the scans for 5 minutes, cited liability concerns about attempting an impossible case, and walked out. Dr. Patel took one look at the CT images and said, "Hopeless." "I'm sorry." Dr. Williams started resuscitation, did 12 minutes of chest compressions, then stepped back shaking his head. Dr. Chen was the last. She pulled off her gloves at 03 for 7 hours and called time of death with the finality of someone closing a book. 5 doctors. All refused. Hannah stood in the corner of the trauma bay, watching the colonel's chest continue its shallow rise and fall. His body didn't know he was supposed to be dead yet. His heart kept trying. His lungs kept working. But 5 doctors had written the story, and the story said he was finished. She watched them leave one by one. When the room was empty except for her, she noticed it, the single dog tag on a broken chain around the colonel's neck, the metal warm against her gloved fingers when she helped move him to the morgue stretcher. The tag bore a name. A rank. And underneath, scratched into the metal, 8th Cave Marjah 2019. Her hands went very still. The date matched. The unit matched. The protocol matched. This was someone from her world. Someone from the ghosts. Someone who'd bled in the same valley where she'd learned the difference between taking orders and saving lives. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric hum. The monitor was already being disconnected. In 12 minutes, someone would come to take him to the cooler. Hannah locked the trauma bay doors. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Every instinct she'd spent 3 years burying suddenly, violently awake. She reached for the surgical scalpel. The muscle memory unfurled like a map she'd memorized in her sleep. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. 1 incision. Find the descending thoracic aorta. Cross-clamp it. Restore coronary perfusion. A field thoracotomy was a wartime procedure, something you did in conditions that made hospitals look like luxury, something you did when 5 credentialed doctors had already abandoned hope and protocol had become the only thing standing between a man and death. Her hand was steady on the scalpel when the door rattled. Caldwell's face appeared in the window, his expression shifting from confusion to fury in a single heartbeat. His fist was already closing around the handle. The trauma bay doors exploded inward at 0212 hours. The ambulance crew moved like they'd already lost the fight. Stretcher wheels hammering the tile floor. Shouting in that specific urgent tone that meant something was broken that shouldn't break. The colonel came in on his back, his uniform soaked through with blood that looked black under the fluorescent lights, and Hannah was there because she was always there at night, the invisible one restocking supplies while the world slept. She saw the dog tag first. It caught the light as the paramedic cut away his shirt, the chain broken but still hanging across his chest, and her hands went very still. Marjah. Mountain ranges that burned orange at dawn. A unit she was never supposed to remember. She steadied herself against the counter. The colonel's eyes were already rolling back, his oxygen saturation somewhere it had no business being, and the paramedic was shouting numbers that meant they had maybe minutes. Lacerated spleen, massive bleed from a training accident, halo rotation malfunction, the lead paramedic called. We've pushed 2 liters. He's not responding. The night attending, Dr. Caldwell, appeared in his lab coat like he'd been summoned. He was a man whose authority was so precisely tailored it bordered on weaponized, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change when he entered a room. He looked at the colonel once, really looked, then stepped back and turned toward the door. Unsalvageable, Caldwell said. It wasn't a diagnosis. It was a pronouncement. Splenic rupture at this volume? He's in multi-organ failure. Call it. Doctor, his vitals are, the paramedic started. I'm done here. Caldwell didn't turn around. He was already leaving, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like a closing argument. The door swung shut behind him. The second doctor arrived within moments. Dr. Martinez, the liability specialist in human form, took one look at the monitor and shook her head. She didn't even touch the patient. Exposure too high. The family will sue. I'm not getting involved in this one. She walked out without making eye contact. Hannah watched her disappear around the corner, her white coat fluttering like a flag of surrender. Dr. Patel came next, pulled from the imaging review room. He studied the CT scans that had just finished loading on the overhead display, his face illuminated by the blue-white glow. The colonel's abdomen looked like a geography of disaster, spleen fragmented, blood pooling in the retroperitoneum, laceration tracking toward major vessels. Patel's breathing shifted. This is beyond intervention, he said quietly. He's already in DIC. There's nothing anyone can do for him. He left the scans up on the monitor like a memorial. The 4th doctor, Dr. Williams, actually stayed for 12 minutes. 12 minutes of compressions after the colonel's heart stopped climbing, 12 minutes of epinephrine pushes and defibrillator pads that did nothing but make his body arch against the stretcher like a puppet on strings. But then Williams held up his hand. Stop compressions. He's been down too long. Neurologically he's gone. He stripped off his gloves and stepped back. The beeping monitors fell away like a prayer nobody was saying anymore. Dr. Chen, the last of them, came to formally pronounce what was already written in the flat line. She looked at her watch. 03 for 7 hours. She wrote it down. Time of death. And then it was just the body and the silence and Hannah standing at the edge of the room where nobody had thought to ask if she had anything to say. The doors hissed closed one final time. The hallway outside went quiet except for the distant hum of the climate control system and the rhythmic beeping of monitors in other rooms where people were still alive and still fighting. Hannah stood there for 11 seconds. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She did what she always did, she assessed the situation like it was a tactical problem instead of a death that 4 doctors had already called inevitable. But Hannah Clarke wasn't a nurse. Not really. The body didn't know that the military had buried her credentials 7 years ago, didn't know that her hands had held lives together in combat conditions that made a trauma bay look like a holiday. The dog tag was still warm. She'd felt it when she'd checked his pupils, the metal pressed against her gloved fingers, and she knew what it meant. She knew what every single person in that room had failed to understand. She locked the trauma bay doors. The click of the deadbolt was quiet, almost apologetic. She turned back to the colonel's body and reached for the scalpel. The instrument tray was still there, never cleared away. Her hands moved without the permission of her conscious mind. Muscle memory was a dangerous thing. Muscle memory from Marjah. From kill zones and hastily assembled field hospitals. From the day she'd operated on 6 wounded Marines in the back of a C-130 with nothing but flashlights and a combat knife and the kind of focus that only comes when the alternative is unacceptable. She touched the dog tag. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. His call sign was engraved on the reverse. Bear. She'd known him. She'd operated on him once before, a GSW to the lateral abdomen in that same mountain range. He'd survived that. He wasn't supposed to die like this. Not in a trauma bay where 5 doctors with credentials had simply walked away. The blade was in her hand when the door exploded open behind her. Dr. Caldwell's face appeared like a storm breaking. His eyes went to the scalpel in her hand, to the colonel's exposed chest, to the reality of what Hannah was about to do, what Hannah had already decided to do. His expression shifted through shock and directly into a rage so pure it seemed to burn the oxygen out of the room. What the hell do you think you're doing? His voice was the kind of quiet that preceded destruction. Hannah didn't flinch. Her hands stayed exactly where they were. The scalpel point rested against the skin of the colonel's chest, between the 4th and 5th ribs, the exact spot where a thoracotomy incision needed to begin. She looked at Caldwell with eyes that had seen worse than his anger. Much worse. A field thoracotomy, she said. Her voice had dropped. It was the voice of someone who'd already calculated every consequence and decided to pay them anyway. He's still viable. You're a nurse, Caldwell said. It came out like a curse. You're a goddamn nurse. Step away from my patient. Your patient is dead. And he doesn't have to be. Caldwell's hand moved toward his hip, his pager. His emergency call button. She saw the decision click into place behind his eyes like a chamber locking. He wasn't going to let her touch that blade. He wasn't going to let her save a man in a way that would make his refusal look like what it actually was, a choice. Security arrived in 90 seconds. 2 of them, walking fast with that particular energy that came from an overhead alert. Caldwell was already moving toward her, his hand reaching for the scalpel, and Hannah knew how this would end. She knew it the moment the dog tag had caught the light on the stretcher. Some oaths didn't expire when the paperwork got destroyed. Some oaths were written in scar tissue and blood and a single broken piece of chain metal. She didn't resist. When the security officers took her arms, she let go of the scalpel. It clattered onto the instrument tray. The colonel's monitor was already flatlined by then anyway. His chest remained uncut. His wounds remained closed. The 5 doctors had already won, and now she was the problem. Hannah Clarke was the problem. Just a nurse. Just someone quiet. Just someone nobody had bothered to really look at. They pulled her backward into the hallway. The trauma bay doors swung shut behind her. Through the reinforced glass window, she watched the colonel's body go motionless on the stretcher, the dog tag rising and falling with the motion of the security officer's handling, that warm metal catching the light one final time before it disappeared from view. Caldwell stood over the body like he'd personally stopped her from committing a crime. And maybe in his mind, she had. Stepping outside the hierarchy. Claiming knowledge she didn't officially possess. Threatening his authority with the weight of something true. Hannah Clarke stood in the hallway outside Sacred Heart's trauma bay, still breathing, her hands at her sides, and waited for whatever came next. She'd already lost everything once. The military had erased her name from official records. They'd taken her rank and her clearance and given her a civilian identity and told her to disappear. She'd done exactly that. But the dog tag had still been warm against her gloved fingers, and some things couldn't stay erased, no matter how classified they were. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause nobody wanted. Hannah stood outside her car with her scrub soaked through, the cardboard box from her locker balanced against her chest, her badge already confiscated and filed in some administrative drawer 3 floors above. The demotion had come in front of the arriving morning shift, unit aide, effective immediately, delivered in the rain by Dr. Caldwell with the precision of a surgeon inserting a scalpel between ribs. She'd stood there without moving, without defending herself, while the day nurses averted their eyes and pretended not to hear the details of her incompetence whispered into the morning air. Now, alone, she took one measured breath. The kind of breath that came before a breach. The kind that steadied hands before they had to move fast. A single tear escaped without permission, cold against her rain-wet cheek, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with the dark hospital entrance across the lot. Her voice came out flat and even, shaped like a statement of fact. The man you condemned to death is still breathing because I opened his chest after you left. She wasn't talking to anyone. The parking lot was empty. But the words had to exist in the air anyway. They had to be spoken. That's how you buried a thing properly. You said it out loud first, watched it settle into the wet asphalt, and then you let it go. The colonel's monitor told a different story 2 nights later. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Holding. Then at 03 for 2 hours, the ICU monitor shrieked like a thing dying, and every line on the screen collapsed into chaos. Ventricular fibrillation. The kind of rhythm that meant no perfusion, no oxygen moving, no mercy. The trauma team that had assembled around his bed 3 hours earlier had already backed away. The code had run for 12 minutes. Compressions had stopped. Someone had called it. Death had won. The room was full of people who were no longer fighting. Hannah was on the step-down unit floor, in a supply closet restocking bandages because that's what unit aides did, when the alarm tone came through the overhead speaker. Not a code announcement. Just the monitor screaming for help nobody was going to give. She heard the voices in the ICU through the open station, calm now, the resignation of professionals who had made peace with losing. She heard Caldwell's voice among them, controlled and measured, explaining why further intervention was futile. She set down the bandage box. Moved toward the ICU without deciding to. Her feet knew the path the way a weapon knows its target. The colonel's room was full of the kind of quiet that comes after surrender. 3 nurses. 2 residents. Caldwell, arms crossed, standing exactly in the threshold as if his body was a door. The full lines were still running. The monitor was still screaming. But the compressions had stopped, and the man on the bed, the one with the dog tag warm against her ribs from 3 nights ago, the one who wore the insignia of a unit that no longer officially existed, was a body now, not a patient. Hannah shoved past Caldwell so fast his protest came out as a sound without words. She didn't ask permission. Permission was for people who had the luxury of patience. She was already moving, already reaching for the crash cart, already reading the monitor like it was telling her the colonel's location the way a scope reads distance. Ventricular fibrillation. Persistent. No rhythm. No time. Step back, she said. Not a request. It wasn't phrased as a question. The residents moved. The nurses moved. Caldwell's voice came from somewhere behind her, sharp with rage and something else, something that sounded like the sound of control slipping away. Hannah's hands moved on their own. That was muscle memory. That was Marjah. That was the training that was supposed to stay buried. That was every protocol she'd been ordered to forget in exchange for disappearing into a hospital's night shift. She identified the hemorrhage source before she even opened the chest, a physical exam that 5 doctors had somehow overlooked, the kind of overlooking that came from giving up too fast. She found the bleeder. And then her hands went to work the way hands go to work when they've done this before, under fire, under desert sun, under circumstances that required you to save lives with things the civilian world would consider improvised. A 16-gauge angiocath needle. Normal saline pushed wide open. Epinephrine 1 mg 4-push. Her left hand trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the kind of shaking that came from holding back everything she actually knew how to do and channeling only enough of it to save this one man without revealing the whole magnitude of what she was. The colonel's rhythm changed. Asystole became bradycardia. Bradycardia became something the monitor wanted to keep fighting for. Oxygen saturation climbed. 68, 75, 82, 91. Stabilizing. His heartbeat came back as a rhythm. As data. As proof that 5 doctors had been wrong. Caldwell's face had gone white, not the white of fear, but the white of a man watching his authority incinerate in real time. The nurses stared. The resident stepped back further. Hannah didn't break rhythm. Didn't acknowledge anything. She was focused on the monitor the way a sniper focuses on a scope, one target, one objective, everything else erased. Security arrived at 0 for 2-3 hours. 2 officers who'd worked the building long enough to recognize that something had shifted in the power structure of the room. Caldwell's orders came out clipped and angry, and they moved toward Hannah like she was a threat, which she was, to everything Caldwell had constructed, to the careful order he'd built, to the absolute certainty he'd installed that a nurse was only a nurse and nothing more. They didn't drag her. She walked. The colonel's heart was steady on the monitor behind her, and that was enough. That was permission to stop fighting. Her badge came off her neck as she walked, handed to the officer without them having to ask for it. The rain had stopped outside. The parking lot was clean and wet and shining like a mirror that reflected nothing but the dark sky above. An hour later, in the administrative office, Caldwell's termination papers were waiting. Gross negligence. Practicing beyond scope. Contaminating a sterile field. Ignoring direct orders. Each accusation precisely constructed, each one a lie that had the weight of institutional authority behind it. Hannah didn't defend herself. Defense was for people who thought the system was listening. She signed the papers, accepted the cardboard box, her NASA mug, the dying succulent with its brown leaves, the photo from her locker that she should have burned months ago, and was escorted out at 05 for 4 hours. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. She sat there with the box balanced on her knees, the rain starting again, heavier now, the kind of rain that came right before dawn. A splash of water from a passing car soaked her shoes. She didn't move. The dog tag in her pocket felt heavier than metal should weigh. She could see the colonel's monitor behind her eyes, the line that had flatlined becoming a line that wanted to live. 5 doctors had decided he was dead. 5 doctors had been wrong. And now there was a cardboard box on her lap and a night shift at Sacred Heart that no longer existed and a photo of 8 faces, 3 of them ghosts, all of them classified. The sun rose. The bus came. She didn't get on it. What happened next changed everything. She sat at the bus stop in the rain, cardboard box balanced on her knees. The fluorescent lights from the shelter buzzed overhead like dying insects. Inside the box, a cracked NASA mug, a dying succulent with leaves like paper, and a photograph of 8 faces. 3 of them were dead. All of them were ghosts she'd been ordered never to speak of again. Her phone sat silent in her scrub pocket. She didn't get on the bus that pulled up at 0417 hours. The doors wheezed open. She watched them close. The brake lights disappeared into the Norfolk rain. What happened next changed everything. The hospital's routine background check for her termination appeal, a standard HR procedure, nothing remarkable, just boxes to check, flagged something in the system that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. A classified security clearance. One the Pentagon had supposedly erased 5 years ago when they'd ordered her to disappear. But erasure is never complete. Digital ghosts leave traces. A flag triggered a protocol. A protocol triggered a phone call. A phone call triggered 7 more. By dawn, 3 federal agencies knew that Major Hannah Clarke, the name she buried so deep she barely recognized it anymore, had just been fired from a civilian hospital for saving a Delta Force colonel's life. The cascade was already rolling. She was standing under the shelter when a woman's voice cut through the rain. Not loud. Just clear. Hannah Clarke. She didn't turn. The box on her knees felt heavier. I'm Elizabeth. Elizabeth Hartley. The woman's breathing was ragged. She gripped Hannah's shoulder, not gently, the grip of someone who'd been driving for hours, who'd been told her father was dead, who'd watched monitors flatline in a trauma bay. My father told me a major saved his life. Hannah turned. The colonel's daughter had his eyes. Grey-blue. Steady. But they were breaking now, tears running down her face faster than the rain could wash them away. She was holding a folder. Military-grade paper. Cream-colored. The kind used for documents that don't exist in civilian filing systems. He said you opened his chest. He said 5 doctors walked away and you came back. Her voice cracked on the word major, like she was trying the rank on for size and it didn't fit anything she understood about night shift nurses. I need you to understand something. I need you to understand that when my father woke up in that ICU, the first thing he asked for was you. Not his wife. Not his commanding officer. You. Hannah set the box down. The rain hammered the cardboard, darkening the edges. Come with me, Elizabeth said. It wasn't a request. The hospital administrator was in the office when they arrived. Her name was Diane Patterson. She'd been at Sacred Heart for 23 years, had interviewed Hannah for the night shift position 3 years ago, had never asked questions about the gaps in her resume or the way she could read an EKG like sheet music. Now she sat at her desk with her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold the folder that had arrived via secured courier at 0530 hours. The folder was 3 inches thick. Her voice came out in a whisper. This came from the Pentagon. I've read it 3 times. I don't understand any of it, but I understand she looked up at Hannah. Her eyes were red. Combat citations. A silver star. You were the primary trauma surgeon for a classified hostage rescue operation. In Marjah. She turned a page. 18 consecutive surgeries performed in a forward operating base with no blood bank, no backup, she stopped reading. Just stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. The folder landed on the desk between them. Medical credentials from the Army, from Johns Hopkins prior to that, from the Naval Academy before that. Photographs of Hannah in dress uniform, her hair pulled back, her face younger but her eyes already carrying the weight of things classified. Awards. Commendations. A single page, heavily redacted, listing 7 team members. 3 names had black lines through them. 2 names had dates. 1 name had a bronze star. 1 name had nothing. Why didn't you tell us? Deanne asked. Hannah didn't answer. Some secrets aren't yours to keep. They're kept by institutions. By governments. By men in suits who stamp classified across your entire life and order you to become someone else. The chapel was full when the SEAL team leader walked in. His name was Michael Graves. Call sign, Breaker. He'd commanded the element that extracted the hostages in Marjah while Hannah worked triage in a mud-walled compound with nothing but a field knife and 5 units of whole blood. He was in dress uniform now, dress whites, the kind worn for ceremonies and state funerals and occasions when the Navy wanted to remind people what the ocean had created. News cameras lined the chapel walls. Every local station had sent reporters. The story had gone viral 6 hours ago. Pentagon confirms nurse at Norfolk Hospital is decorated combat medic. The hospital had held an emergency press conference. The colonel had recorded a statement from his ICU bed. Major Hannah Clarke saved my life. I would be dead without her. Graves stood at the pulpit. The room went dead silent. I served with Major Clarke in Marjah for 14 months, he said. His voice was steady as a surgical laser. She was attached to our team as primary trauma surgeon. Her official title was Captain, Army Medical Corps. She ran a forward operating base with a staff of 4 enlisted medics and the kind of casualties that don't usually survive. But she saved them. She saved most of them. He opened a folder. Bronze Star with Valor. For sustained excellence under fire. The reporters scribbled. The cameras recorded. Hannah stood at the back of the chapel where no one could see her reaction. Purple Heart. Graves paused. Looked directly at Hannah. 2 of them, actually. First was a blast injury. Second was a gunshot wound to the left shoulder that didn't stop her from returning to surgery the same day. Hannah's left hand twitched. The old scar tissue remembered. Distinguished Service Cross. Graves' voice dropped an octave. This was the moment. For pulling 6 men out of a kill zone after her medic team was ambushed. For performing field surgery on all 6 while under active fire. For refusing to leave until every man who came in breathing left breathing. The room didn't move. Cameras didn't click. Even the rain seemed to pause against the chapel windows. She'd never been awarded the DSC in any formal ceremony. The citation had been classified. The photo ops had never happened. The Pentagon had decided to bury the whole operation, bury the colonel, bury Hannah, bury everything that happened in that compound where the walls still held bullet holes and the floor still held bloodstains that washing couldn't remove. Graves closed the folder. Those are the medals. And that's Major Hannah Clarke. The woman your hospital just fired for saving a man's life. The next voice anyone heard wasn't a reporter's. It was an FBI agent standing at the chapel entrance, her credentials already in the hands of the hospital's security chief. Behind her were 2 more agents. Behind them, a liaison officer from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service wearing insignia that meant he had clearance for things that didn't have names. We're here regarding Major Hannah Clarke, the FBI agent said. The Pentagon has released her classified file in conjunction with an investigation into her employment termination. Major Clarke was the primary trauma surgeon for Operation Nightfall, a classified hostage rescue that the government had sealed under executive order. The official record has now been unsealed. Major Clarke is not under investigation. She is, in fact, a protected witness whose identity was compromised during an incident at this hospital. Protected witness. Classified operation. Identity compromised. The words fell like bombs into very still water. Dr. Caldwell was standing in the hallway when the news broke live on every channel. His face went the color of old bone. The monitor in the break room showed the Pentagon spokesman reading Hannah's service record. Combat citations. Decorated combat medic. The thing Caldwell had spent 6 days systematically destroying, a career, a reputation, a life, had never actually been a nurse named Hannah Clarke at all. It had been Major Hannah Clarke. United States Army Medical Corps. Retired from active duty under classified circumstances. Ordered to disappear. Ordered to work night shifts in civilian hospitals under an assumed civilian identity. Ordered to speak to no one about why. And he'd had her physically removed by security for saving a man's life. His hand started shaking. Not from fear. From the understanding that he'd just eliminated someone who could actually end him. That he'd escalated a conflict with someone whose institutional backing made his own authority look like a child's toy block tower. That every move he'd made, the reassignments, the the supply closet threats, the overhead page, the demotion in front of witnesses, the fabricated documentation was now evidence in what would become a federal investigation into his conduct. He tried to destroy a legend. And the Pentagon had just confirmed it on live television. The irony was perfect. Brutal. Absolute. 6 months later, she wore the uniform again. The major's insignia sat on her shoulders like they'd never left. Her team at Walter Reed was efficient and respectful, the kind of men and women who understood that quiet authority was the most dangerous kind. She ran the trauma bay like she'd been doing it for 40 years instead of being erased from official records for 5. The tremor in her left hand was gone. Physical therapy had helped. Knowing who she actually was had helped more. 3 critical patients came in during one shift. Combat injuries from a training accident at Camp Lejeune. One had a penetrating chest wound. One had catastrophic abdominal trauma. One had a vascular injury that was bleeding faster than anyone could replace. Hannah moved between trauma bays with the kind of precision that made younger surgeons stop and watch. No wasted motion. No unnecessary talk. Just the sound of vitals being called out and equipment being deployed and blood being typed and cross-matched and pushed through lines like liquid survival. All 3 walked out of Walter Reed. That evening, she drove back to Norfolk. The hospital hadn't changed. The rain was different, autumn rain, colder, carrying the smell of salt from the Elizabeth River. The colonel was being discharged tomorrow. She found him in his room, and he was sitting by the window watching the river flow toward the sea. He showed her the dog tag immediately. Worn metal on a chain that had been broken and reforged so many times the links didn't match anymore. "My sons," he said quietly. "Kandahar. 2009, when I felt that tag against my chest in your trauma bay, I knew something was different. I knew I had to fight." He turned it over. The engraving was worn almost smooth. "You know what objects carry?" Hannah nodded. She understood that some oaths don't have expiration dates. Meanwhile, Dr. Caldwell worked the night security desk at Sacred Heart, checking badges under fluorescent lights that turned his face the color of old concrete. Former colleagues walked past without meeting his eyes. A nurse he'd once supervised stopped at the desk, looked at him for a long moment, then continued toward the elevator without speaking. He sat back down. His shift ended at 0600. It had been ending at 0600 every night for 6 months, and every night it felt like a slow death by institutional anonymity. On her way out of the colonel's room, Hannah passed a young nurse in the hallway. Quiet. Competent. Invisible. The nurse had a slight limp and old scars on her forearms that weren't from anything routine. Hannah recognized something in her eyes, that particular quality that comes from having survived things that shouldn't have been survivable, and she paused. "Good work tonight," Hannah said. The nurse looked up, surprised. "I know what you are," Hannah said. "I know what you're pretending not to be. Just don't forget who you actually are. The world needs that more than it needs the pretending." She continued walking. The dog tag rested now in a frame on her office wall at Walter Reed, beside the photograph of 8 faces from Marjah. 3 were dead. 2 had dates next to their names. 1 had nothing but a redacted line. But they all had names. And Hannah remembered every one. Her trauma bay ran with controlled chaos most nights. Critical patients. Incoming fire. Civilians and soldiers and the occasional civilian who'd been a soldier and was pretending not to be anymore. Her voice carried over it all, steady and precise, vitals. Set up lines. Get me typo neg. Simple commands. Clear direction. The kind of authority that came from having made life and death decisions in places the government had ordered her never to discuss. One of her junior residents asked her once why she'd left active duty. "I didn't," Hannah said. "I'm still here. We all are. The ones who served in places that don't officially exist, we're still there. We just find different trauma bays. The ones that don't have security clearances. That evening, she returned to her office and looked at the dog tag again. The metal was warm. It was always warm. The colonel's son had carried it in Kandahar. The colonel had carried it in Norfolk. Now Hannah carried it. And somewhere in the walls of Sacred Heart Hospital, a young nurse with scars and a limp was learning what it meant to hold on to things that the world wanted to erase. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If you've made it this far, you know what real strength looks like. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek praise. It just saves lives in the dark and then keeps walking. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who carry their secrets deeper than anyone should have to, and comment if you've ever underestimated someone who turned out to be a legend.